Loud alarms are ringing for many who've read Brittany Hughes' January 3rd MRC-TV piece on the introduction of a bill in the New York State Assembly claiming the power to remove or detain people suspected of being infected with a dangerous contagion or having come into contact with any such person. It's what many freedom lovers feared and expected authoritarians to do, repeating the disastrous mentalities of those who established internment camps for Japanese Americans in World War II, and even darker, the Nazi, Soviet, and Chinese communist camps that saw tens of millions caged and killed by those governments. And there's a new revelation about this New York proposal. It turns out that the sponsor, New York State Assembly member N. Nick Perry, a Democrat, actually has attempted and failed 3 times in previous sessions to pass pretty much the same exact obnoxious, dangerous, authoritarian piece of legislation. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and I want to take the opportunity now to refer you to Brittany Hughes' excellent January 3rd piece on this subject and her video about this. And I decided I wanted to go into this myself from a slightly different angle and then sort of end up at the same destination as Brittany. Because this piece of New York legislation is not just obnoxious, it's not just unconstitutional on its face, it's not just immoral. It is a tie to some of the worst actions of government despots in the history of the past 2 centuries. This piece from New York Assemblyman N. Nick Perry is reminiscent of concentration camps that have been put together in the United States and other countries that have led to the crushing of civil liberties and to millions of deaths. And it seems like the pop media is not discussing this. So let's talk about this new aspect that I've discovered. It's the fact that this Assemblyman, Democrat N. Nick Perry, has already attempted 3 times to pass this kind of legislation. Beginning in the 2015-2016 session of the New York Assembly and failing to pass what was called A689, Perry then pushed and failed with A680 in the 2017-2018 session, and then he repeated the insulting and aggressive spectacle with A99 last year. And of course, Mr. Perry is now pushing the monstrosity called A416 in the Democrat-dominated disaster of a state. This bill should shock anyone who cares about the scraps of liberty that remain on the floor of the political slaughterhouse of the United States of America. It's so riddled with slippery language and undefined terms that if it passes, the New York government could detain people based on any pretext the governor or his health commission concocts. If the governor declares a public state of health emergency, which is already an unsound basis for government operation, and that's something we'll address later. If he says that there's an emergency due to a communicable disease, well, here's what the bill would allow him to do. Upon determining by clear and convincing evidence that the health of others is or may be endangered by a case, contact, or carrier, or suspected case, contact, or carrier of a contagious disease that, in the opinion of the governor, after consultation with the commissioner, may pose an imminent and significant threat to the public health, resulting in severe morbidity or high mortality, the governor or his or her delegee, including but not limited to the commissioner or the heads of local health departments, may order the removal and or detention of such a person or of a group of such persons by issuing a single order identifying such persons either by name or by a reasonably specific description of the individuals or group being detained. Such persons or group of persons shall be detained in a medical facility or other appropriate facility or premises designated by the governor or his or her delegee and complying with subdivision 5 of this section. He's already tried 3 times to push this kind of thing. You'd think he'd be able to get it right, or perhaps check the U.S. Constitution and see that none of it is right. Here's the first problem. The term clear and convincing evidence is supposed to be a so-called standard to constrain the agents of the state within this legislation. But the definition of clear and convincing evidence is, of course, determined by the state. And that's like asking a spousal abuser to define the word abuse. It's just circular. It's a non-starter. Problem 2, the very concept that the governor or his delegee may order the removal and or detention of such persons by issuing a single order flies in the face of the Bill of Rights. Specifically, it runs contrary to the 4th Amendment requirement for a warrant in order to search or arrest someone for commission of a crime. It's a contemptuous insult to the 5th Amendment as well, the pertinent portion of which we might want to remind the assemblymen reads, nor to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. I guess the guy is so busy writing bad legislation, he doesn't have time to read the Constitution he swears to uphold. Just no time. This passage itself is also a breach of the 6th Amendment assurance of a fair and speedy trial. It's a breach of the 8th Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment for, as I've mentioned before, how can one be punished and imprisoned without a trial? It is also a breach of the 14th Amendment's reiteration of the process of a jury trial, and it doesn't even specify what removal means. Removal from what? From where? And it gets worse. Reading, a confirmed case or a carrier who is detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section shall not continue to be detained after the department determines that such person is no longer contagious. A suspected case or suspected carrier who is detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section shall not continue to be detained after the department determines with the exercise of due diligence that such person is not infected with or has not been exposed to such a disease, or if infected with or exposed to such a disease, no longer is or will become contagious. So much for committing a crime against a victim, so much for a jury of one's peers, and so much for the tradition of law that actually goes back to the Magna Carta. And anyone who's familiar with how slippery and uncertain the CDC has been with its official determination of whether asymptomatic positive cases, as they call them, represent high or low risks for transmission, knows that the government is not to be trusted with either your precious liberties, science, or the definition of words themselves. In June of 2020, the CDC, quote, didn't actually have the answer, end quote, about asymptomatic spread of COVID-19. Then, after its fear-mongering, and of course after the election that saw states push for mail-in ballots, the CDC finally announced in early December that, as with most coronaviruses, the chance of transmission for those who were asymptomatic was next to nil, and that asymptomatic people didn't even need to be tested. Then there's the entire problem of the lack of reliability for both the PCR, that's polymerase chain reaction test, and the so-called rapid test. The rapid test is not quantitative, meaning that titer is not determined. And the PCR test, as its inventor Carrie Mullis said, is not reliable as a diagnostic tool for determining whether someone is diseased.
It's a couple of technical problems I was trying to solve, and one of them, the way I decided to solve it was to like run a sort of sham reaction first, with the oligonucleotides in place and the sample, and then add my radioactive tracers and stuff and run it again. and because it was going to use up it was just not for the idea at first of like duplicating the signal, but then I realized the side effect of that was going to be that I was going to double the signal if there were enough like deoxynucleotides available. And I was trying to get rid of those if there were any coming in with the sample.
And the more often the material used in the PCR test is, quote, cycled, end quote, the more false positives it creates. Even His Health Highness Dr. Anthony Fauci recently admitted the problem of PCR unreliability.
What is now sort of evolving into a bit of a standard that if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. So that if somebody, and we have patients, and it's very frustrating for the patients as well as for the physicians. Somebody comes in and they repeat their PCR and it's like 37 cycle threshold. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
As a result, even if this portion of Perry's bill were sanctioned by the Constitution, and again, it is not, it is strictly prohibited by the Bill of Rights, as I just noted, the CDC already has shown the unworkability of government to determine contagion risk, and the bill leaves the determination up to the arbitrary whim of bureaucrats. This is the kind of thing that Hitler, Mao, and Stalin might have found very impressive. And Perry isn't even through. He pushes more of his Gestapo-like COVID camp phrasing. A person who is detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section as a contact of a confirmed case or a carrier shall not continue to be detained after the department determines that the person is not infected with the disease or that such contact no longer presents a potential danger to the health of others. That could pertain to anyone with a simple head cold or anyone who came into contact with said cold sufferer. An old, weak person increases his or her risk by coming into contact with a person who has a cold. But we're realistic about these risks. And this point is actually something to keep in mind, since because of all the fear-mongering and drumming about cases, and thanks to the government payments to medical centers if they list deaths with COVID-19 as deaths from COVID-19, people often forget that the survivability rate of this particular virus is actually quite high. They forget that in September, Breitbart reported the survivability rate for this disease called COVID-19 as being 0 to 19 years old, 99.997%, 20 to 49 years old, 99.98%, 50 to 69 years, 99.5%, and 70 years old or older, 94.6%. Based on the way the pop media and many politicians and bureaucrats have pumped the fear gas, does anyone not think that Perry's constitutionally dubious bill would be employed in other low-risk situations should this bill be passed? And 3 final points. First, Perry offers this. A person who is detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section as a contact of a suspected case shall not continue to be detained, 1, after the department determines with the exercise of due diligence that the suspected case was not infected with such a disease or was not contagious at the time the contact was exposed to such individual, or 2, after the department determines that the contact no longer presents a potential danger to the health of others. That repeats the problems outlined in the previous section and piles on another arbitrary government-defined phrase, quote, or after the department determines that the contact no longer presents a potential danger, end quote. And how will the state do its magic contact tracing when the 4th Amendment prohibits agents of the state from searching your personal belongings unless they get a warrant from a judge citing the person to be searched and the items sought? Well, that's all thanks to the wonderful 1996 federal HIPAA statute, which was called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and which many national politicians falsely said protected your medical data, but which actually claimed for the government the power to collect your medical data anytime they want. No warrant, no judge, no rights. And on the subject of rights, let's reiterate something essential from Brittany Hughes.
A New York state legislator has introduced a bill in the New York Assembly that, if passed, would allow the governor to forcibly detain a person for up to 2 months without a court order if they're suspected of carrying or having come into contact with someone carrying an infectious and potentially deadly disease, like COVID. The bill allows for that person to be detained for up to 2 months without a court order, and then in 3-month increments if the court signs off on it. All if the governor or one of his designated lackeys decides the person poses a health risk.
Well, there's no such thing as public health. There's only individual health. The moment the government claims that it has to work for the health of the public, it's claiming that it can infringe on your rights and harm your ability to care for yourself. It's embracing a consequentialist, ends justify the means approach to the individual who can be sacrificed for the larger group or whatever group that the politicians decide makes up their public. This is how eugenics is pushed. This is how eugenicists push for the extermination of the elderly and infirm, and how they push for abortion and sterilization. It's all for the public betterment and public health. I wanted to make sure that I did this video because Perry's A416 in New York cannot be allowed to go unnoticed. It's an abomination of a proposal that he has, in various forms, tried and failed to pass in previous sessions of the New York Assembly. We have to study these things and tell people why its very foundations are contrary to the fundamental precepts of life itself. Thank you so much for watching and for spreading the word, everybody. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, please make sure you're still subscribed. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and suggest it to some friends. Please share these videos, hit the like button, smash that like button, as they say at the 10th Amendment Center. And if you get the opportunity, head over to MRC-Store. That's where you can find this fantastic shirt and many, many other MRC items and support the Media Research Center. Go to MRCTV.org to find out what we're doing. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Parler, Twitter. We're all over the place. And I'm on Twitter too, @GardGoldsmith, and I'm at Gab, @GardnerGoldsmith. Thanks so much, everybody. Big, big thumbs up to Brittany for getting the information out there, and big thumbs up to you for caring about individual freedom and real principles. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.